a barrel roll. Never give up. Trust your instincts.
When you become a prominent mathematician in that sense, it doesn't mean that many people know your name. It means that many mathematicians know your name. And there aren't many mathematicians in the world anyway, so it doesn't count very much. But it suddenly released me from feeling that I had to live up to my promise. I had lived up to my promise.
Hello everyone, no intro this time due to the aforementioned losses of the field, so we're just gonna get into the details. This week mostly consists of enemy coding. One of the problems of my own making was that each enemy I made within the strategy mode, they were sharing the same basic game object. The reason being is that each encounter is housing many different types of enemies, and the enemy in the strategy mode can dynamically change its behavior depending on what enemies are left from where the player left off. The problem was that, unlike the enemies in the flight mode, I did not make individual scripts for each enemy behavior that talked to a base script. I eventually made this for the strategy versions of the Wandering, Aggro, Beam, Stationary, and the new Shooting enemy. More on that soon. Now this solved the main problem of organizing behaviors, but it adds a new problem. There's more scripts on one object, executing unused logic every second. I already had a function to change the enemy behavior states, but not the scripts. I made what I call a component container. It only has one function, and it checks to see if the enemy key is given within its parameters, and decides whether to turn it on if it matches, or turn it off if it doesn't match it, minimizing unused logic. With this, I can speed up my enemy making process. The newest enemy is the Shooting enemy. Starting with the strategy portion, its main behavior is to stand back and shoot at the planet. First few steps, it'll be stationary, then it'll begin charging, and then shoots the bullet. It won't go towards the target, but if any of the players get close enough, it'll back away and reset its process. The only ways to encounter it is to get it while it's charging, or making it back into another ship. In the flight mode, the Shooting enemy is stationary. If the player encounters it while it's charging, it'll show that it's charging in the flight mode. A timer will show up when the charging begins, and lightning particles will show up. I repurposed the Beam enemy particles and made it stationary and added some lightning particles for added effect. After it's done counting down, the bullet will be launched. If the bullet gets away, it will show up in the strategy mode once the encounter's done. But if the player actually takes the hit, which it'll hurt a lot, and it won't show up even if the player doesn't survive, adding more consistency and enforcing that it's not over when the bullet is fired. The Shooting enemy isn't the only enemy I started. I have ideas for a railgun enemy. Think the Shooting enemy, except much more dangerous. Taking the bullet isn't an option, but it will take longer to charge. The Exploding enemy, where if you get too close to a certain phase, it'll make an explosion in the strategy screen and give damage to anything in range, including enemies. The Spawner enemy does exactly what it implies. It'll spawn enemies. And I plan on making missiles to add more obstacles or challenges in the on-rails mode. I plan on making the missile actually move and be separated into different sections with different challenges and hazards for the player to overcome. Even more so, I plan on adding instances where the missiles will separate into individual sections, giving players situations where they have to split up, which may or may not be a good decision depending on what's happening. Again, just adding more varied challenges. I initially hoped to get all this in before the devlog, but unfortunately my particular process is a little masochistic. I try to make preliminary sketches till I get a look I like, and while at the same time being distinct from the rest of the enemies, particularly for the top-down icons. Then I draw the front, side, and top views using meticulous squares so that I could get everything as accurate as possible. Then I scan them into Blender for modeling. If you want to know more about this process, I recommend Scott Robertson's How to Draw Anything. It's honestly one of the best books on perspective and environment drawing. Okay, that was a lot to go over, so let's get into some more simple polish. I added an enemy health bar that will appear and disappear depending on if the reticle turns red or not. When I was making the Shooting enemy in the flight mode, I wanted it to have more health than most enemies because it's charging, and also to make the timer seem more reasonable and make its size more emblematic. I wanted to give the player a clearer sense of feedback when they hit it with bullets, because when the timer's ticking and all you see is a red flash, you can't be sure if you're actually doing anything. For a similar example, you could look at the Kingdom Hearts games after Kingdom Hearts 2 to get a good example of this kind of health bar. far. There's still some bugs when switching enemies, but that's definitely on the list. Going back to the strategy mode, I said last time that the entry animation of the enemies wasn't up to par. At least for me. It was just an expanding and shrinking circle while increasing the transparency of the enemy as it's happening. All of which is still there, but it needed something extra. Something fuzzy. Something pixely. Something two-dimensional. Blender to the rescue. I learned some of the basics of Blender's particle system, and I made a basic torus and vortex wind components to get the basic shape. I also gave the reference sphere / particles and emission shader so I could get some extra bloom for added effect. And from the top-down view, it already looked good, but it needed to fit the art style. Using the pipeline I used for the asteroid object, I lowered the camera resolution and rendered the animation. Importing it to Aseprite, taking out a few frames, getting rid of the background obviously, and adding black shadows in another layer to adapt to the strategy art style. I'm pleased with the result. At least for now, anyway. This was a lot, but not as much as I would have wanted to, like I said. But that's nothing new at this point. Next time I hope to get at least the majority of the new enemies in, along with other bits of polish. That'll be it for this week. Let me know if you have any questions or feedback. Take care of yourselves and have a good week.